Okay, we'll see whether or not this is starting up this time here. Clickety-clack, clickety-clacks and stuff like. And there's our troubles in paradise, and we will stop doing that and get back over there. Now, theoretically, we are on the air a few minutes early. I've been trying to work up the thing where we can actually show some of my video opening up, and I have not yet been able to do that with complete success. The last time I tried, nothing seemed to be happening, even though it was playing on my screen. Whether or not I've connected up properly or not, we'll find out. At any rate, this is a recap show to fill in the ones that didn't work terribly well. I'm not wildly enthusiastic about the picture quality in here. It's a little bit blurry, although it seems to share screen thing. I'm not sure whether it's to do with where I'm positioning relative to the camera, whether I'm angle it in a different direction or not, and I'm not entirely sure what the hell this is going on. I'm trying to center myself in the screen, do the best I can on that, but a little bad depending upon what direction I'm going on. I'm just using the fill light from the scrim thing, the light bulb that fills in for the main camera that I have on the PC. But anyway, such is life. And we'll find out whether anybody shows up in the chat thing. The show that I had originally done and that ended up on the wrong channel had to do with, oh gosh, book here, Replacing Darwin, which is Nathaniel Jeanson's attempt to replace Darwin. And I'm terribly sorry, it's not going to do it. It was given to me as a test case to investigate, and it doesn't have active sources. Ah, hello, Jay. Hi. Here we go. We got someone in the mix. Hello. We've got Jeanson is finally getting into the finish of his chapter 3, and so I'm reprising that information on this show so that I can then put it on my own channel and put all the links and stuff in that I had tried to do or wanted to do when we did it on October the 14th, where it ended up in limbo land where I can't edit it. So we're going to try to resolve all that. Anyway, I'm reading on my other screen here. Jeanson had material on the donkey genome. There's a 2015 paper that I'll be able to put a link up to, which explicitly confirmed that the donkey species diverged around 1.5 to 3 million years ago, along with pinning down a suite of adaptive mutation shifts in them compared to the horse. And Jeanson doesn't mention any of that. So really, should you have called attention to it? And then we've got a paper from 2005 on domestic dogs by Lindblad Toe that Jeanson cited, which identified the gene duplications in their lineage, as well as detailed canid phylogeny going back 10 million years. Also information that wasn't being discussed in Jeanson. And bringing up Lindblad Toe's work, in fact, was probably a bad idea, because their groups didn't stop working in 2005. And so I've got a 2011 paper from Nature on human evolutionary constraint using 29 mammals that builds on this. And I'll be curious to see whether Jeanson ends up citing any of that work when he gets down farther chapters where he's diving into human evolution. That's the whole problem of the book. It doesn't have an index and doesn't have a reference bibliography. It means you can't really tell where they're getting material from for individual points, or to see whether or not they are aware of a work in one context and not applying it to another context. It's hard to locate that without that ability to see a reference index, a reference file. The fact that to find a book that is purporting to aim for a technical audience, and it is aimed at a technical creationist audience, and missing that, doesn't work. It's confusing and awkward. Now, there's been a lot of different criticisms, and I'll be getting into that as I dive into the particular chapters that's been brought up by Dan Stern-Cardinale and Erica and others that pointed out problems with their argument. And I'll bump into those Evograd and others who have commented on the various Jeanson work. It also should be pointed out that Jeanson has never gotten anywhere in persuading anybody. By the way, Walking Fish is having a wonderful debate, I hope, as we speak, on modern day debate with Standing for Truth on Neanderthals. I was going to watch that. In fact, I was involved in the preparation where we did actually Dan Sturgeon Cardinale acted as the critic from hell to try to get Walking Fish, Walker, very coordinated on the ball in terms of being able to take really hard criticism. And Standing for Truth is fairly amiable but repetitive. It should be much, much milder on that. And by the way, for those who are annoyed by the lights in the glasses, I duly apologize for that. I live with it. That's the way it goes on here. Sound like this. Oh, and it gives me an ominous appearance. I like my jowls and my forehead. Anyway, the Jeanson book at the moment is still running in the range of 100 sources, roughly a source per page. It's not exactly spectacular. And for a technical work, pretty thin, of which a chunk of their sources already, he's misrepresenting them, roughly a third. And whether or not this continues all the way down. Hello, Vesta! Welcome to the actual show that's sort of functioning. I don't know whether or not my opening intro thing worked and whether or not I'm going to be able to jiggle on over at the mid-range and put on the commercial for the Rocks Were Their book that our dear pal Peter came up with. I'll be in kind of awkward screen sharing mode, but we'll worry about that a little bit later on. For those just coming in, then the replacing Darwin material. It's nice to get rid of chapter 3 and to move into chapter 4, which will be where I'll be resuming next week and continuing on for those weeks because it's starting to get into biogeography, which is a really bad area for creationists to deal with there. Oh, Jay asked, you can't really cite magic. Well, the funky thing about it is that Jeanson doesn't claim to be citing magic. He's arguing that there is, in fact, a perfectly legitimate argument based on genetics that supposedly, absolutely, positively. Let me try with my glasses off since I'm not doing any reading in here. He's doing everything pure sciencey. You find the same argument with Jeffrey Tompkins and John Sanford, his genetic entropy book, and any of the technical papers that are done at Answers in Genesis Research Journal or the old Journal for Creation, which is still operating, by the way. And for that matter, over in Discovery Institute land with the biocomplexity. Well, they're arguing not magic, that true science and rigorous genetic evidence and so forth can actually support their case. It doesn't. And you can find out that it doesn't when you start diving into the technical material and realizing just how much they're leaving out, just how much they're suppressing, just how much they're manipulating, and how unpersuasive this has been in the general science community. It's no coincidence that none of this stuff is cited by regular scientists, or their work isn't done by conventional scientists, because it is useless, absolutely useless. Unless you go to Hocus Pocus. There was apparently a Hocus Pocus 2 special that was done somewhere or other with Bette Midler and others. I think it was in relation to the lead up to the election, which we have just had. I'll put some little comments in on the political side here before moving to other parts. That we've had a tumultuous thing, but it's looking pretty good for Mr. Biden to get his 270 electoral votes. He's about 6 shy. If Nevada ends up going for him, then that means that even if Donald Trump goes into conniption fit lawyer mode, which apparently they are, and Rudy Giuliani comes out of his coffin and does stuff to try to dislodge Pennsylvania, it won't matter. Pennsylvania's electoral votes aren't needed. We still don't know about Georgia, South Carolina, some of these states where the margin for error between the two, even though Trump's in the lead in those states, is so slim that the big metropolitan areas whose votes they haven't counted yet can theoretically swamp that. So, but anyway, it doesn't require Pennsylvania, and it doesn't require South Carolina, and it doesn't require Georgia. So that 270 would be independent of it. And we'll see how that all holds. And then the item to look out for will be mid-December, I think, when the Electoral College actually convenes to certify the president-elect. And then, of course, the next hurdle is January 20th, when hopefully not Mr. Trump will be inaugurated, and probably Donald Trump will skip town because he's such an egotist and whiny little guy that he can't stand not to be the center of attention and also to be visibly having the loser. He won't like that at all. And so I really would be gobsmackingly surprised that he would actually attend the inauguration under those circumstances. But we'll see. Best of it with you being in Spokane, you can just slip over the border. Yes, into Canada. Well, I don't have a passport, so I would never be able to get back. I still got to be able to glom onto a passport at some time. And in thinking of the border, I was almost thinking about the border to Idaho, because Idaho has a bunch of folk that are anti-maskers over there, and we've got a little bit of problems here, even in Spokane, where some the head of the local county health department was summarily demanded to be fired for reasons that we can't tell, and it sounds though like a bunch of anti-masker activists are complaining about him, and so it's kind of a wackaloon here. Washington State has had a slight uptick in cases, as has, but way less than most of the country has, because we've still been very prudent. We wear masks going out to do business and all of that. So we've been pretty functional in terms of businesses being open, even restaurants and things. You can go up to the pizza place and get pizza, and without any difficulty, because everybody is behaving reasonably. The next president, whoever that is, will have to deal with that, because we don't want hundreds of thousands of more people dying and overstressing emergency wards and all that. It's going to be quite a ways down the line into 2021 before even any vaccine becomes available, no matter who's doing it. So anyway, that's a little side bugbear on that. Let me get in while we've plowing along before I get to part two. We'll get to way ahead on part one. I will thank my patrons. Eventually, I'll want to get some documentation up on the screen and stuff, so I can do that the way I did it on the other one. But it's one thing at a time. Word documents and that, I may have to do it as an image or PDF or something. I don't know. Anyway, my colleagues, Hendro, Eric, Speed of Sound, Suris, Seshi, see, I can read without my glasses. Travis Adams, Ian Chen, Convert Me, Stephen Early, Ethan Neal, James Fitzwater, History Minor, Ralph McFadden, Apologia, Benjamin Simpson, Doranku, Totis Real, Christopher Johnson, Daniel, Steve Bauman, Marigail Beddoes, Insects Cool, Devin Reeves, Morton Nielsen, Paul the Skeptic, Puffalopagus, Bo Hobo, Rasmussen, Alex Stone, Paul Williams, and our legacy patrons, Jen and Jody, Mike, John, Keith, Andrew, Dyer, Yui, Mona, Brad, Daniel, Nana, Staggle, Sun, Skystone, Ugly German, Bruce, Everett, Vince Hansen, Sarah Weisbaum. Every one of them has made a big difference over the months and years, and the fact that there have been people sticking with me on the patron front, even with all the uncertainty everybody has had about COVID and financing and individual jobs and all the rest. I very much appreciate it. And it has made a huge difference in plunking along, especially when unexpected expenses come along. I got to get the garage door repaired, and otherwise I can't get my car out. It's gotten stuck inside. And so stuff like that, if you have the resources to be able to deal with it, then that makes life much, much easier to deal with. Anyway, the part two of the show that I had done in the earlier version of this related to pterosaurs. There was a commenter on Facebook, Paul Onaga, who tossed a 2-minute video excerpt from Carl Werner's anti-evolution stuff, and I'll be putting a link to that YouTube thing up. And it was basically a string of authority quotes. Carl Werner is a German creationist, young earther, who was just authority quoting stuff from Gunter Viohl and Peter Wellnhofer, with a bunch of dissolve edits in the video indicating that the clips he was clipping had stuff left out. That's always a bad sign on there. And there was no source documentation offered in the video description, so it makes it really hard to even track down what the hell's going on here. Well, I'm not unfamiliar with pterosaurs and their evolution, and Peter Wellnhofer, who wrote a very, very fine set of books over the years, of which I have one of his older ones, on the whole pterosaur line and their various evolutions. And Viohl and Wellnhofer's pterosaur quotes turned up to at several times at a particular website, evolutionist quotes blogspot.com from 2011. Their own words might surprise you. and I have accessed that, and I'll be putting a link into that so you can kind of see how the quotes churn around through the Creationist network on there. One of the ones from Viohl was we know only little about the evolution of pterosaurs. The ancestors are not known. Dot, dot, dot. When the pterosaurs first appear in the geological record, they are completely perfect. They were perfect pterosaurs. And listed he was the curator of the Jura Museum in Germany. Well, that is most probably a excised bit. Yeah, all organisms are perfectly formed, accurate, existing organisms. What do you expect? Like a ear to be popping out of the forehead and an arm to be emerging from somewhere? And no, that's not how things work in the real world. And in fact, genetic mutations that cause extreme things like that tend to be fatal, and you don't get along very well. So those don't get passed along to your descendants. The issue is involving whether or not they can pin down the ancestor of the pterosaurs. Pterosaurs start out very small, bird-like things, about the size of a crow, and they're relatively rare. Vesta says, finally watched the debacle you have with Nephilim Free. Why did you do that to yourself? It had me screaming at the monitor. Well, Nephi will do that with people, yes. The most recent one was on biogenesis, which I had a lot of fun with. And I thought it was, hello, Nana. I thought it was a useful operation. I know enough about Nephi. I've seen him enough times that there was nothing surprising on it. And I wanted to get in the whole point about why Nephi was going an origins or bust argument to begin with, why they're obsessed with it, which goes into it's an evasion mechanism that anti-evolutionists go into to avoid thinking about like the reptile mammal transition and all the other evolution evidence that we have. And it doesn't matter. When I'm looking at the reptile mammal transition from Permian period, a quarter of a billion years ago, it doesn't matter how life originated billions of years earlier. It doesn't matter how cell replication and ribosomes and all these other systems developed. It could have been by miracle for all anybody knew. And it wouldn't change what we see way down the line in the reptile mammal transition. And that's the whole underlying problem with origins or bust arguments, is that it's a way to keep them from thinking about all the parts that they can't account for. So they go back to a part where, well, you can't explain the origin of life. Darn it, I don't need to explain the origin of life. Probably has a natural origin, doesn't change any of the facts. If it is not a natural origin, doesn't make their absence go away. So back to Wellnhofer and his Viohl. Pterosaurs are the first vertebrate flyers, and they date back in the early Triassic period, so they're a little bit before dinosaurs. And because dinosaurs are just starting to kick into the field in the later Triassic. And they are small critters. Rhamphorhynchids, I think, is the fancy name for the main group of the early pterosaurs. Virtually all of them are found in deposits where it's a lake that's anoxic and one crashed and drowned, and the body got preserved pretty well. So those are the rare cases where you can actually find the fossils of them. So they're fairly sparse during the Triassic period because they're extremely tiny animals with quite thin bones. Pterosaurs with their wing finger thing, they're hollowed out and very fragile. So the odds of preservation, other than in these very rare circumstances where they manage to get drowned in an anoxic Lagerstätten, are fairly remote. Where did they come from? Keep that in mind. But what happened next? For there, actually, you can trace pretty good the evolution of the rhamphorhynchids that start dominating in the Jurassic, and this is before birds had come along. And then when birds come along the scene, the flying theropods in the middle Jurassic and later, or late Jurassic on, the Cretaceous, they don't drive the pterosaurs to extinction, but smaller forms are probably getting outcompeted by the new flapping dinosaurs. And the pterosaurs get to be monstrously large. Some of them may have been completely terrestrial, even though they could theoretically fly and glide. The exact habitat, some of them are fish feeders. They've got little straining things in their bills to handle that. It'd be lovely to see their actual behavior. It looks like they're quadrupedal when they hit on the ground. And unlike birds that are bipedal and bats that are quadrupedal. But they had a very, very long run, and you can trace their various lineages. So what did the earliest pterosaur, where the stem group from which it developed? Where would you likely see such a thing? What fossil rocks could you go to in the right time and place? Is it likely that you're ever going to be able to find any of that? The fossil genie doesn't always deliver, at least hadn't delivered at the time that Wellnhofer was doing work many decades ago, but the things don't stop. And so the one point is no creationist ever explains what an ancestor would need to look like to satisfy them or where to go to look. But it turns out that in order to get from a particular kind of a reptile to what would be an ancestral form for pterosaurs, um, has particular characteristics, including this little pterygoid bone that is on their limbs that is a distinctive feature. It's a tiny little sliver that gets out. And exactly how that originated, we don't know the genetics of it because all the pterosaurs are extinct. So we can't look at their genes. Darn it, Dutch. Anyway, it turns out that just this year, Congonophan was discovered, a pterosaur relation, very tiny little critter. With sort of features that was considered likely for pterosaurs. There's a new technical paper on it in PNAS, which as yet isn't open access. All PNAS proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences becomes open access after a year. So tick, 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 just waiting for it to happen. Sometimes PNAS puts open access stuff right from the get-go, but it wasn't this case. And I did find a couple really nice summaries. One from Smithsonian Magazine that has some really dandy pictures, and another one from the Hindu.com on SciTech Energy that talked about this the group in its ecological context as well. So I'll be putting posts into those, and those are quite nicely done. Yes, everyone say hi to Besta. Best says, I love the reaction you had when Mr. Batty started his sermon, letting the fingers do the walking. Yes. We get I had a debate as well with Mr. Batman, who is um, someone who makes Nephi seem scholarly. He was basically a vague philosophy guy trying to simply argue as an ad hoc, general presumption materialism argument, and that was very great. It was supposedly on dinosaurs coexisting with the Bible, about which poor Mr. Batman knows absolutely nothing, and about which I know a great deal. And I also know the creationist literature in here. So he was just basically off in left field trying to wave a presupposition argument while denying that he's a presuppositionalist. For some reason presuppositionalists don't like all presuppositionalists. That's ones where you simply presuppose certain non-negotiable assumptions and then run with it. And gosh, if your opponent doesn't accept your presuppositions, well, that means your argument can't go very far because it's presupposition. Anyway, the pterosaur thing then is that the fossil genie just keeps coming through on that. The odds of finding such a critter, it's likely a sister group. It's very similar to what we would expect early organisms to look like. It doesn't have that indication of that little pterygoid bone, so it's not the absolute clincher. But if you're going to look for what a pre-pterosaur would look like, it looks like a little funky little lizard. And it'd be wonderful if we had more of the fossil record in that. Hard to tell what period it would be, late Permian, early Triassic. How long of a time frame it would be for the development of pterosaurs, maybe 5 million years, 10 million years. But there's an awful lot of hole in there. There was a mass extinction event at the end of the Permian, just as there would be another mass extinction event at the end of the Triassic. So you've got a lot of critters checking out, and how many of them are exactly the ones that you need for the pterosaurs and others that you're never going to find because they never got in the right kind of fossil deposition context. Yeah, that's the way it goes. Meanwhile, the paleontology works on there. So the funky part, I discussed a bit of it on this in both 3 back revolutionary episodes, which you can get at the website, www.tortugan.com, or WordPress.com. And also in the Dem Bones chapter 2, which went into the flight issues, because you got 3 big vertebrate flyers. You've got your pterosaurs that are membrane flyers. You've got, although they apparently had like a hairy filament on top of that, that's only been discovered in the last like 30 years and has now been confirmed by quite a lot of fossil discoveries. That do it by the extinction of one of the fingers. And then you've got the funky little birds that come along, which are basically feathered theropod dinosaurs that develop more aerodynamic feathers, but they don't really require any new radically new anatomy or bending of anything. And eventually they're extending their already formed arms that just have feathers on them. And some of the ones even have legs, feathers, in the case of microraptors. Some have almost like a membrane bat-like thing, but with feathers as well around the rest of the body. All of those competitors kind of fizzled out, and it's only one group, the ornithine birds, that made it past the KP extinction, and then took over as the dominant thing because all their competitors had died out, including the enanthrodithines, which were the dominant birds prior to the KP extinction. Why that one group went extinct and the ornithines were the only one that made it through? Was it luck, or were there dynamic characteristics of their biology that gave them just a bit of an advantage in the post-Cretaceous extinction world? Hard to tell because we don't have enough information on it. But the flip over was indeed. And then you got the bats. And bats, if we go by the fossils, they're another membrane flyer, but they are the entire hand spread out rather than just a single finger acting as a membrane support. And the membranes are attached a little bit differently than the way you find in bats. Bats, again, like pterosaurs, are from quadrupedal ancestors. Tiny little critters to begin with, which is why their fossil record is so small. Oh, terrible. The first fossils are like 50, 55 million years ago. Which is about 10 million years after the mass extinction, Cretaceous. But the genetics keeps on hinting that bats may have differentiated way earlier, sometimes in the late Cretaceous, which would put them as contemporaries with not only birds or pterosaurs. So it would be a funky thing ecologically to be able to time machine back to the late Cretaceous, where we would see simultaneously in ecosystems where there are giant pterosaurs, sometimes on isolated islands, huge gliders that can fly long distances. You've got little itty bitty birds in a variety of different packages and coming out of the dinosaur branch. And then you've got these little itty bitty mammals that are membrane flyers, the bats, developing perhaps. And they might all have been contemporary. This is a really interesting thing as to what this would be saying about their environment. The early pterosaurs were possibly insectivorous, early bats, insectivorous. Birds are coming from a bit different environment, omnivorous and coming off of those theropods, but how many of those got to be specialized organisms? And eventually there was a general trend to get rid of teeth. So whatever they were doing, they didn't need teeth. They were just swallow, and away you go. So bugs may have been a factor in there. And the disappearance of a stabilizing tail. Pterosaurs often don't have a stabilizing tail. So there's a whole bunch of neurological systems that are going on to be able to fly without one of those. They sometimes have really incredible veins and stuff, bony features on their heads that possibly acted as steering mechanisms and other things, as well as sexual displays. We know how much variety occurs in bats and birds, which we have living examples to see all the soft parts put in. But hard to say about what was going on with the pterosaurs, but boy, it'd be lovely to deal with it. And given the time frame involved, you've got from the early Triassic of 240 million years ago all the way down into the late Cretaceous of 65 million years ago. That's a long run. And even with the fragmentary nature of tiny fossils and the somewhat bigger ones, when you get into the larger pterosaurs, you start finding pterosaur tracts, which are more difficult to imagine preserving for the very earliest pterosaurs because they're little teeny critters with little tiny little feet. And so the odds of getting a tract preserved there is as bad as trying to get insect tracts, which can pop up occasionally, but the luck of the draw. Always the fossil genie out there, always dealing with stuff. Vestas says on the Mr. Batman, You could have argued with him, what is better, old motor oil? And Mr. Batty would not have changed his script. You're absolutely right. Yeah. His argument was absolutely generic. It was absolutely content free, independent of the content. Yes, he could have been talking about motor oil or whether or not um, um, you should use dominoes with a 6-6 or a 12-12 size to play dominoes with. I mean, completely irrelevant issue. And it's kind of sad when you deal with people at that level. He eventually was starting to rail on about pedophilia and all sorts of Looney Tune stuff. He's got issues clearly, and a combative jerk who is never going to be able to get anywhere on things. What I do in all the debates when I end up now, I've started doing it for the last couple of times, just to point out that nothing we say in these things will change any of the facts. They're just purely entertainment and an ability, a venue to present what science facts are, and hopefully can get some fun out of it and spur maybe some of the viewers to be enticed to start looking on their own and investigating, because the science is so bloody interesting. Let me see if I can point correctly. Whoops. There. That's the rock through there. And go over there. There's the evolution slam dunk and the Paralogs of Phileas Fogg novel up there. It's very difficult for me to do these things backwards. That I decided to follow the technique of the various Zoom people that I have seen online and in television shows, where if they've got books that they have written, like Buttigieg or others, conveniently the book is sitting over, not terribly close up, but over like on a shelf somewhere. And so, and there are links to, I don't put the links to the novel in there, but if you slip over to Amazon and see the rocks were there, and then you look down to people also buy or links by the same author and so forth. Find it pretty well. And by the way, I'm up to writing the finished chapter 30. I've got like 7 more chapters to do on the second Paralogs novel, where there are more adventures for Phileas Fogg and company in the 1870s. So that'll be a teaser. With a little bit of luck, I'll have that finished in the next few months. So it probably will be out certainly by fairly early in 2021, unless an asteroid hits or whatever. Where are we? Ooh, we're only about halfway in. Let's see if we've got anybody have any questions for the exciting world in here or not. In the next quite a few weeks, I've been plugging together the material for future shows that we'll be picking up again with where Jeanson left off when we finally get into his biogeography chapter. And there's a lot of material on horse phylogeny, and then there's newer material. I get stuff sometimes from young Earth creationists that are brought to my attention. Sometimes people actually ask about particular topics, so feel free in the question section. I get little notifications of people commenting on the various videos, and that's usually pretty comprehensive, so I don't miss any of those. And I'm able to say, oh yeah, I'll see what goes on in there. And some of it is really juicy, where it really warrants fitting in with the a discussion in the new second volume of The Rocks Were There, which Jackson and I will be diving into with a vengeance next year. That will pick up where The Rocks volume. Boy, everything is there. There we go. Boop, Rocks Were There, volume 1. We'll pick up and do the other half of the work. There will be stuff in there on flood geology, human evolution, origin of tetrapods that will flesh out more. Plus, we've got follow-up material, because there's been a lot of new technical work in the last couple of years that wasn't included in volume 1, and that we'll be bringing in volume 2. New examples of creation is stupid that pops on down the line. And so it'll still be as up to date as volume 1 was. And we'll have stuff going. I think I've got material going out here until well into late December even. There will be some more Gunter Viohl from the intelligent design movement on the Ediacara biota and Cambrian explosion stuff and all of that. Aquatic dinosaurs. There's a whole bunch of side issues that pop up in there. It's always funky when anti-evolutionists light into particular technical material, um, that what they want to bring up and what they leave out, and also whether or not it's areas in their own field. I'm a little more impressed with creationists that at least are diving into their own area of expertise. So if they're a plant biologist, they're actually talking about plants. I'm increasingly less interested in creationists that, Vestas says you have an ETA on volume 2. Won't be probably lighting into it until early next year. And so hopefully, cross fingers, by holiday season 2021, we should have it out. It's a big undertaking. The first volume is like 900 pages long, and it had like 4,000 sources, and the second one will be very detailed in that as well. We want to make sure that everything is coordinated with the cross index and all that stuff. It'll have the same set of appendices as the first volume. I think those were quite useful on the geological charts and the phylum issues and the genetic codes and stuff like that. That gives a lot of interesting side material on there. And then the plenty of info boxes, which will be covering specific material. So it's going to be really juicy material. We're going to be going into the tornado in the junkyard. Hi, tornado. Um, the background history of the Mesopotamian flood stories. That's going to be playing a big part because we didn't really discuss that, I think, in just a brief allusion to it in book 1, but that's diving in full bore as to where the Bible story came from, how it adapted, what was the various multiple Mesopotamian stories. Atrahasis and Gilgamesh is only just one of the various stories involved. There are different heroes in different pops along over time. And also the Arctic encounter, which we discussed a lot of the baraminology side of that. Here we'll be going into the philosophical issues and the and their evasions of the dark side of creationism relating to the racism angle. The descendants of Ham supposedly were black people and all of that. So there's a bunch of stuff going on there. And there'll be a big section on cosmology, planetary formation, Jason Lyle and that bunch that try to rearrange their little young Earth cosmology. It's a fascinating issue because that's another advantage of writing this book now than, say, 10 or 15 years ago, because we've got information from Hubble Space Telescope on planetary system formations, stellar formation, that's much more specific and flying in the face of the creationist argument. So part of the thing is to see the goalpost moving. When reading an awful lot of Answers in Genesis books, you have to be amused at what used to be in them versus what gets changed along the way. So you just have to have this mental as the goalposts get moved. And one of the ones that we'll be discussing in somewhat more detail has to do with how creationists deal with paleocontinents and supercontinents, and how there's a split as to what the pre-flood world supposedly looked like, and then what the flood world is supposed to look like, and the post-flood world. Or Tornado says Pennsylvania so far 184,000 vote lead for Trump. That's been pretty standard all the way along the line. But yeah, they've had a huge amount of uncounted votes. Actually, tighter is Georgia and South Carolina, where there's only like 60, 70, 80,000 votes difference between the two of them. Trump was theoretically in the lead in both those states, but if they haven't counted the metropolitan areas yet, the large cities in South Carolina and Georgia with the Atlanta metro area, that could flip. But if the last counting that was being done from AP, Biden had 264 votes electoral and only needed 6 more, and Nevada has 6 electoral votes. So they're supposedly going to be finishing their count by tomorrow. So theoretically, tomorrow we should be able to know whether or not Nevada has continued that trend and ended up on the Biden column, in which case he got 270 votes, and that means it doesn't matter what happens in Pennsylvania, and it doesn't matter whether Georgia or South Carolina flip at all. They'll try to dislodge Michigan, and he's apparently unleashed the Kraken, Rudy Giuliani, who's swept in with a bunch of furious lawyers, and they're apparently trying to get I can't say GoFundMe, but nevertheless donations to fund the Republican campaign to dislodge some of those votes, which is a pathetic thing, but it also shows how skinflint Donald Trump is, because, you know, the alleged billionaire uh, could he finance his own campaign? He shelled $60 million out for the 2016 campaign, but basically not a dime for this one. And one suspects is because he doesn't have a hell of a lot of money floating around. So, yeah, Vesta brings up most creationists avoid the previous 5 supercontinents. Let's have a brief supercontinent discussion. Everybody knows about Pangea. That's the one that existed at the time of the Permian, and it was breaking up in the Triassic. In fact, the mass extinction, if you look at my website, and why haven't you looked at my website? The chapter, or the tip module 1.2 on mass extinctions has stuff on the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. It's under several names, but it's now the camp, which is a volcanic rift zone that at the time was in the middle of land between North America and Europe, what would eventually become that. And eventually that splits open and produces the Atlantic Ocean. Well, no Atlantic Ocean at the time. So it was volcanoes and all that, and spewing stuff out. And as many plate rifts do, you can see the same process going on in the Great Rift Valley where human beings started to develop back down in the south of Africa. That whole area is coming apart like a zipper. And eventually that stuff will swing apart, and that's what rift zones do. But anyway, Pangea was at one time considered just the supercontinent, but that's only a quarter of a billion years ago. As they began to build up more and more geology and realize that plates were moving, and plates can do all sorts of fascinating, interesting stuff, it began to dawn on them that there may have been supercontinents earlier. So the first one that was really clearly identified was Rodinia, which is about 1 billion to 900 million years old, so about 500 million years before a little bit more than that, before Pangea. They're all oriented slightly differently. So you've got Pangea, which is a north to south pole thing. And think about what it means in paleoclimate terms. The difference between a supercontinent that runs pole to pole, so there's a gigantic panthalassa, and a landmass that runs from one to the other. No surprise, you got landmass inside that's quite dry, and it's all fairly hot in certain areas, although you can have ice ages and glaciation up on the poles. Think about that same continent rotated around and focused on just one hemisphere, in the southern hemisphere, for example. And that's kind of what Rodinia involved, where a huge mass of that was more in there. And as you start getting into like the Precambrian world, after Rodinia has been breaking up, most of the land masses are clustered in the southern hemisphere. Places that are now way up in the north, like Siberia and chunks of the Pacific Northwest, and others were, and all of the Lagerstätten in the Cambrian period in Greenland and China and British Columbia and all the rest, at the time they were formed, were equatorial in the northern coast of this Gondwanaland section of what was to eventually become pieces of Pangea. So think about how different it is when your world ocean is in one hemisphere, north versus south, as opposed to one hemisphere, east versus west. So there's circulatory patterns that are happening differently in those things. So when you're trying to work out paleoclimates, you not only have to pay attention to mountain ranges and where things were in terms of where monsoon seasons and all that can come in. What's different about all of that, though, is that as you go farther back into time, before the Pangea supercontinent, there's nothing on land. All the life's in the sea. You probably have some bacteria flitting around, but it's long before you have plants that can colonize and insects that can colonize. All that's in the period leading up into Pangea. Now, as you think about how difficult it is to piece things together, and here are plates slamming together and subducting like that and so forth and so on, most of the pieces get obliterated. And so trying to piece together what was going on, you can infer things from climate patterns and others as to whether or not you were talking about supercontinent as opposed to just an isolated landmass. But there is an argument then that you have a good evidence for the Columbia supercontinent, and there's various pieces of it that are called by varying names, and I think it's looking like approximately every 500 or 600 years cycle of supercontinents. But all of those, from the Precambrian all the way down to Rodinia, would have been in an environment where the only stuff going on was in the sea. And there's an awful lot of change going on in there, and early chordates and all that are popping up in that time frame, but still different dynamic. Let's see. Names of all supercontinents. Gondwana, Laurasia, Pangaea, Pannotia, Rodinia, Columbia, Kenorland, and Nenya. I think Gondwana and Laurasia are actually kind of components of stuff. And my tendency is to think that they're just big land masses in the same way that Eurasia is a big land mass and the Americas are big land masses, but they're not connected together in a way that forms a supercontinent where they're all mushed. So Gondwana and Laurasia come together in part. I think your Kennerland, I'll have to look into that one. Nenya pops up as a terminology, and I think by then you're talking about 2 billion years ago or something like that. I'm just pulling the memory out of there. It's a long ways back. Bits and pieces of those, of course, remember where we find out about these things. Those rocks are part of existing land masses on the surface. So there are people scampering around in the wilds of British Columbia or up in Russia or somewhere, and we're finding little teeny snippets of land that when you start peeling back its age and peeling back where it was located, you start getting into a new mode. Now, another thing, for those of you who don't watch Nick Zentner's stuff, and if you don't, well, what the hell is wrong with you? I'll put his name in here. I mention him every once in a while. He does the most spectacular geology videos. He's a college professor at Central Washington University there in Ellensburg. And in addition to stuff that's more directly related to course content, he also just has discussions and travel things, and he takes you around with his little iPod thing and makes recordings and interacts and interviews geologists and that. He's just a wide-ranging stuff, and he's arguably way more spectacular than old fart me in the ability to explain clearly, to conceptualize, to use just meat and potatoes examples, or I should say, German chocolate cake, French fries, crinkle cuts, Tootsie Rolls, fruitcake. These are all examples that he has used, and string beans and pizza boxes to make clear what's going on in geological processes. And just a couple of weeks ago, he did a really rip-snorting good set of stuff. We'll be alluding to it in Rocks 3, or Rocks 2, next volume. There will not be Rocks 3. Don't scare it, kids. About the new techniques of 3D modeling of deep ocean subduction elements. So when you think about those little subduction plate gizmos, that plate's coming down, what happens to this stuff down here? Well, it doesn't completely disappear. And it turns out that with the extremely sophisticated dimensional modeling that they can deal with from the seismic information, they're able to clarify these big slabs of subduction material from hundreds of millions of years ago that have kind of scrunched up. Have you ever seen those Christmas candies that look like little squiggly things like this? That's kind of what it looks like, as these plates get melted and crunched and bent and blobbed up, but not as a big blob. It's as layer cake squiggles. And those kind of get stuck and act there almost like a tongue of land that's way below material. And one, for example, is physically underneath where New York is. But when it was a subduction zone, it was out in the Pacific. The landmass of North America has moved across this slab that basically hovers in the plates or in the mantle area above the mantle, stuck there. And when we think about these big mantle plumes, the things that produce the central magmatic, the cap thing, the Deccan traps, and various other things. Put up the channel on that. Use YouTube. Thank you, Gup. Believe me, Subscribe to his channel. If you are a geology person or just fascinated by material, and a good college professor that can give you an idea about how to explain and interact in ways that are just so riveting, Nick is just incomparable. He's got an amazing following of people who have been accumulating him over the years, who realize, holy shit, this guy is informative. And you'll learn stuff because he's trying to understand the stuff himself from his perspective. And he's not super techno geeky in terms of putting links up to technical papers, but he puts the paper up and puts it up in front of the camera in old school mode, and you can track. That's exactly what I do. I take notes off of his videos, and his the last well, he's going to have an A to Z thing, so it's literally dozens of episodes. Oh, ribbon candy. Thank you, Vesta. There we go. I'm not terribly fond of that style of candy, so I don't, but it's the kind of stuff that obligatorily ends up in grandma's house in the little candy jar, that kind of stuff. And it's just like knock you dead sweet stuff. A little bit of that goes a long, long way. And some of those little squiggly ones were really massive. And when you're a little kid, you're basically filling your mouth up with this giant blob of stuff. They're not like little itty bitty candies that smaller mouths can handle. But those are the memories of an old fart. Anyway, back to geology. The series as he's been doing lately is on my Pacific Northwest. I live in Spokane, and that's at kind of the edge of the area to Seattle. And so all this is real estate I drive across when I go visit my relatives over on the Pacific Coast. And everything from Spokane eastward till you get to Seattle is a fascinating melange of stuff that's very ancient geology that's gotten splunked from pieces from Europe and Asia that has gotten clogged together. And then a lot of it gets squished in these tectonic faults, and other parts of it then in the area right where I'm in the eastern Washington state and in northern Oregon and part of it in Idaho, is the monstrous Deccan traps, or not Deccan, the Columbia basalt that erupted over many millions of years. That's the German chocolate cake he talks about in there. And then the smaller eruptions later up on have very different constituency to them. They look very different. And so those are the crinkle cut French fries and the Tootsie Rolls on top of that. And by that time, we're about down to like 10 or 15 million years ago. This is way before the Missoula floods come along. And that big blob of that volcanic material, the Grand Ronde it's called, and he calls it the German chocolate cake, has covered over so much that we don't know what's going on underneath. So a lot of the clues about these geological shifts have probable pieces underneath that you can't get to because there's all this German chocolate cake on top of it, preventing you from accessing it. And unless you can find ways of drilling down to it, and it's not terribly feasible or economic to do all of that stuff. And so all of that stuff links up together to make sense about this immensely complicated geological thing that have pieces that go back into the Precambrian in some cases, other big swaths that are going on during the Devonian and Ordovician, pieces from all over different areas. And one of the things then this new work on these deep slabs that are being cut off is that in some cases in this one area, there's Skiskenia, I think it's called, that they can now be, by this new data, figure out exactly where it was in latitude and longitude back when it was an active volcanic fault system, because of the nature about how long it takes for stuff to move where and what connects up to what and what latitude the paleomagnetism was and all that kind of stuff. They're actually able to figure out that there's this fixed plume and that there are these series of little super geysers, I suppose, that are inside of the mantle, just as there are these big slabs of crinkled subduction fault stuff. That means that that whole world between the crust and the mantle is an interesting dynamic that the geologists of the next 30, 40 years are going to make sense out of on an incredibly detailed scale. And his face was just lighting up with excitement to think about how sophisticated all of this is. Says geology is the poop, so much to learn. Oh, yeah. And in many respects, you'll be at an advantage coming at it in this world of the 21st century, even though he makes a great point of discussing how things have come to be the way they are. So he'll be talking about geology works that were written in the 1920s and the 30s, Harlan Brett's, all the series that he'd be doing on the flood geology, or the Columbia Fault, Missoula flood things from 15, 14,000 years, 12,000 years ago. All of that work initially was begun in the 1920s and 30s and into the 1950s by J. Harlan Bretz. And you have other geologists in the 50s, 60s, 70s period. That's the thing when it was dawning on them that continental drift was real, and they now had a mechanism that would be plate movements, and that revolutionized the science in there again. And so there's newer layers and things going along to where people start realizing something that's ridiculously simple, that you can imagine a plate coming together like this and slamming together, make mountain ranges, or one coming up over the other, subducting. You have examples of shear faults like your San Andreas, where one of them is going like this. You can have ones where plates come up over the other. There's a bunch of different ways faults can interact. But one thing that's just starting to be appreciated is what happens if the plates come at an angle. They've always been thinking just this nice, neat, perpendicular. What happens if they slam into each other, shearing? And it turns out that looks like it can make some really odd and intricate and different geological contexts that will produce a different kind of a rock formation that you're going to get if they're just coming in splat like that. So all of that material is going to be distilled down and presented as some of the relevant material in Rocks 2, because try to account for the geologic details from northern California through Oregon into Washington, into British Columbia, and up to Alaska, with these intricate rock elements that are coming in from different pieces over different times. The rock can be formed in one time frame and not accreted to the North American continent until hundreds of millions of years later. And all of that jigsaw puzzle would have to happen in like a year, 2, 5, 10 in a flood context. Holy moly, this is way more complicated than I think almost any creationist who comes at it from a dibble-dabble point of view by reading stuff and answers in Genesis has the foggiest idea of how complicated. Gup says, I live on the Wasatch Fault. It's a slip fault as the plates pull apart. Yeah. A lot of the terminology and things, some of which relate obviously to local names and things, that I never connected up with other things, like the Wallula Gap, where the water was funneled in with the Missoula floods and all of that. It's such an amazingly wonderful story, and it also shows the forensic detective work of how the actual geologists build up, try to figure out what's going on. There's a source methods aspect to Zentner that also illustrates how don't try to drag your theory in to begin with. First, find out what the data are. Find out what the facts are, what the rocks are, what the characteristics they are. Don't try to put theory onto it. Don't try to account for it. Just let the facts start building up. And only then later on, as you build up all of that, can you start testing out, well, wait a minute, could this account for it? Is that possible because of this fact over here? What the hell's going on? And you literally get to see in a way that will be very informative if you're a technical geologist, but also if you're just a layman, you will have no difficulty being able to understand what the hell he's dealing with on it. And you can dive into it at whatever level of technical interest you wish as to how far the technical work you want to follow up on with technical papers that are available if you Google them. So it's really wonderful. Vess said, the first time I went to Missoula on Highway 90 to Idaho, early 70s, I did not know about the Missoula Flat. I looked at the hills and the various openings. Oh, I have the technique here. Boop. I think we can put that up. There we go. I forgot that we have like a button up in here that allows me to stick stuff in there. I'm still new with the stuff that's going on. I don't know yet whether I can put rings up on this unless I opened up the versions on YouTube. So there are cases that if you don't have a wrench already, you'll probably not until I can worry about that later. But yeah, that's also very interesting. Missoula, I'd driven by Missoula umpteen different times. It's just a bunch of hills you see, and there's a little M up there for the school. and you're just driving. There's a big valley. No notion that you were riding through an area that used to be a gigantic glacial lake, and that you were nearby where there were mammoth ripple marks and other things, and detritus of moved, these cataclysmic floods that had happened as glacial ice dams broke up again and again and again and again and again and again and again. This was not a one or two thing. And it's creationists have tried to expropriate the Missoula floods, and Mount St. Helens is another example that gets expropriated. And Jackson and I discussed that in some length in the book that I always have. There we go, right there. The rocks are there. Steve Bauman, who is a supporter of the channel here, he's a working geologist. He started to do YouTubes and things as well. He helped vet all of our technical material on there, so we wanted to be absolutely as solid as all get out. Up says tornado has a wrench. That is sufficient. That you'll discover that Zentner often mentions the roadside geology book series, and you can go to your local bookstore or probably find these in a lot of libraries. They're ones for every bloody place in the United States. And they're basically driving tours where you can get in your car and follow along and drive and see the stuff. They've gotten vastly more sophisticated and better illustrations and information from when they were doing this back in the 1990s, when they were really kind of getting going on it, to now the current volumes of them. And he often draws upon them because they are so well researched and so well illustrated that allows you to get a hands-on feel for the geology of wherever you are. And so that's another point. If you're going to tackle young Earth creationist flood geology, a handy place to start is to get the roadside geology book for where you live, and to familiarize yourself what the geology is of how the place under your own feet came about. And another route is, if you're going to debate a creationist, find the roadside geology book for where they live and know what's underneath their feet, and challenge them to explain that data with a flood model. Ironically, Kent Hovind, for example, used to be down in Pensacola, Florida, and then he skipped across to Alabama. I can't remember what his town is there, where he's got his latest digs. But the actual geology of all of those regions has a geology. It has a history. And it's amazing that the creationists don't bother what's going on under their own feet. This is very different from the history of geology, from Nicholas Steno, the priest back in 1500s, who was wondering, why does that mountains over there look the way they do? How did that come about? And he was the one that worked out stratigraphy. Gupta has mentioned Lake Bonneville, drained over the north of Utah, Snake River around Pocatello, Idaho, was probably a huge flooding event. Oh, absolutely a big flooding event. In fact, that was I attended a very nice lecture series at our community college here from local geology clubs. And one of the ones was specifically on the pesky problem that when we're looking at the Missoula floods draining in from Montana, repeatedly from these glacial lakes at the foot edge of these glacial lobes, that you would have debris come in and more debris come in and debris come in. Sometimes, again, the debris would be swept away and there's left of it. So you had a series of, in Lake Missoula, a series of different lake levels. And it was not the case that the lake level here is earlier than this one or later, that the lake level can vary back and forth depending on how much water was in the lake. And that creates different volume that's going on. Well, some of the debris, see what happens when a flood hits a lake that's already there. This happened with Lake Coeur d'Alene, and also they deduced that there must have been a Lake Columbia here, where I live in Spokane, Washington, where there's no lake here now. There's, I mean, a bowl of things, and there's the Spokane River that comes down through. But back during the glacial flooding times, there weren't outlets for that, and there was a big lake here, Lake Columbia, it's been called now. And so what happens is the Lake Missoula floods comes downstream, hits Lake Coeur d'Alene area, which slows the water down a bit, and it starts dropping debris rock. So you have at the bottom of Lake Coeur d'Alene to this day, because there's still a lake there, is all this debris that's the heaviest stuff that's falling out as the water slows a bit, sloshing over Coeur d'Alene Lake. And then we find exactly the same stuff here in Spokane that's formed when the water hit Lake Columbia. Eventually, it eroded so many holes in the landscape that Lake Columbia drained completely. And when the ice ages end, there's no lake here, unlike Lake Coeur d'Alene that still has a big scenic lake. Now, they found stuff then down with the Snake River coming into that Columbia Gorge, other debris rock of that type, but not from the Missoula floods. This is way earlier. And so it's stuff from Lake Bonneville down in Utah, which was mega lake. Think Salt Lake City, Salt Lake on gigantic scale. It was a mammoth lake in that area. And it breached things, splashed down the Snake River and into what would eventually become the Columbia Gorge, depositing all this material in there. So yeah, around Pocatello, Idaho. So yeah, not just a probably huge flooding event. And I think I'm trying to remember when that was occurring, whether it was like 25,000 years ago or something like that. But anyway, it was quite a bit earlier than the Missoula floodings that are occurring from the glacial lobes from the north area. And this isn't the only place on Earth where this has happened. You find these big glacial lake things popping up all through history. This probably was occurring all through any time when you had glacial deposits. There's a thing, I think, going all the way back to like the Silurian, down in places that were in the supercontinent in Gondwana, where you had the rim area around the big glacial forms that were at the South Pole at that time, around where Antarctica is still, but had South America and future South America and Africa and Australia and all that all connected to it. That edges of those were producing these floodings, and I think there's some spots in Central America, South America, where they have the deposits from where this stuff was coming down in these Missoula-style floodings, and this is back 100 million years ago, something like that, long time ago. That you can see from the same characteristic bits that they're working backwards to figure out where the glacial areas were and where the drainage routes were and all of that. And so it's a colossal and absolutely fascinating jigsaw puzzle. So Salt Lake City was under 1,000 feet of water. Yeah, just to give a comparison for the Missoula floods during the flood part, that the amount of water coming out of Missoula floods at the big floods, by the time it got to Portland, it was still 500 feet of water. And boy, would have been noticeable. And the other issues are the extent to which certainly the Missoula floods are within a time frame where Native Americans were there to experience it. So they have stories about big dragon gods that make roaring sounds, and the tradition that you had to stay away from the river. You didn't want to come down to the river. Rivers were dangerous places where water comes up. And they had a good reason to think that. If you look up the Bonneville flooding and all that, Wikipedia probably has a perfectly good intro as to the time frame on it, and then they'll have links in there to the technical paper. Nothing wrong with Wikipedia as a secondary source bridge. It's not a destination resort. It's just a place where a lot of useful science information and historical information is brought together and can give you a stepping stone to get to other stuff. And then if you want to look at it more seriously, we alluded to the Bonneville flood and the Missoula floods and that in volume 1 of the book that I'm still trying to figure out how to point to. There we go, easily. Because they're really wonderful. There's side issues as to how you deal with catastrophic flooding. Well, we're past the hour here. Now I'm going to see whether or not it's possible for me to, let me pause my, okay. Whoops. See, and the problem, some of this thing disappears on me when I try to deal with stuff. When I try to pause it, you're hearing it, but I do not see where the hell, come on. Okay, there I got an image finally. Now we have to jump back and see if I cannot get my screen share again. And now the old RJ is behaving in a way that's incredibly clumsy and pathetic. Now let me go to my application window. I'm trying to find out whether or not the stuff is heard on here. When I've been trying to do some of this. It's ended up, okay, where am I? Oh, there we go. Got that. There. And let me see whether or not that actually plays. Move that over to here. And at least the video, if I can get it seen, and whether or not the sound will come through as well. And I'll find this out later. I think Peter did a whiz-bang job on the book advertisement. We're both very proud of the work, Jackson and I. It was fun to write and is informative for both lay people and people with technical science interests. So covers the whole whammy. And it will give you some rib ticklers since we're going into the holiday season. What a perfect, whoop, there we go. There we go. What a perfect gift. There we go. I'm watching my little arrow come along in here. Sometimes the buttons are a little skittish and I hit things without realizing it. Laptops are new for me. There we go. Boop. And then stop sharing and I'll find out whether or not that worked or not. There we go. For you in the live chat, did that pop up on the screen or not? Since I've got people actually in the chat there, can you give me some feedback on whether or not the rocks were there commercial showed on screen and whether or not it had sound? And see if it did not hear the ad. Okay, I haven't figured out what I'm doing wrong on audio. There may be a button that I can look through. There's a thing for screen sharing, and then there's another stuff. There's just a mute button. But whether or not there's any settings and things I'm going to have to play with on there, we'll work about that. But then again, when I tried to do the video with the sound before, it was a problematic thing. So this may be kind of a difficulty with the YouTube. Trust me, there was just a wonderful set of music on there. But that means I'll just have to figure out that when the image comes across, I'll just have to talk, and that will cover it. But at least I was able to put that material up. I have them on my laptop and that get them set up. So there we go. This is the second episode of the RJ Old Fart Goes Solo. We do know that the invite guest mode has worked because we've had people on the show. We had Brainbug on last week, and he had better picture than I do. I am jealous, but he probably got a better camera on whatever he's using as a platform. But such is life. And anybody that's looking for RJ for a visual feast is in the wrong room. Let's just get used to that. So anyway, I think that pretty much covers everything for today. Once the thing, it seems to take about a day to finalize so that it doesn't actually show up on my channel as a linked thing until the next day. And then I can go in and edit it and put all my blurbs and stuff in there. Yeah, I'll add the links to the I always on the video description, there's a link to both Slam Dunk and the rocks were there, and also to the website, the Troubles in Paradise thing, the whole shebang. So that's always in there every single week, and in addition to all the little technical links on that, that's pretty fairly straightforward. Now that we are in the holiday gift giving season, for your own wonderful reading and or as gifts for your people who love wonderful reading, for masochists who have creationists that they despise and yet want to lavish money on them, they can buy my book and send it to them as a gift to annoy them. There's all sorts of fun gimmicks on that. But in terms of the technical research and stuff in there, they're at college level, but they're written for every person. And I want to kind of get the two together to where no one should be intimidated by science work. It's got specialized terminology and things that you, in the same way that if you realize about car mechanics, there are things you need to know about it, and it's studyable. And hopefully we can explain things in such a way to get that off it. Because I'm not a scientist, I'm from a history background. If I can do it, everybody can do it. So good night, everybody. Stay safe, everybody. Hopefully things will continue to go. If Nevada comes through, then that means when we hit the 270, there we go. Happy, happy. And it didn't take the Senate, but that was indicating larger problems. The Democrats have tried 3 times to get the Senate, haven't been able to pull it off. And that means it'll be an interesting time. There may be enough people in the post-Trump era that you can get some working majorities going, independent of Mitch McConnell, although being that he's in charge of stuff. And the fact that you would have Vice President Kamala Harris there as a tiebreaker vote in the case of things. So it would be a different dynamic that's going on. So, Gup said, thankfully, I don't know anyone who needs to read your book. Well, you can just find people who should read my book, and also everybody who, do you want to keep quick access? No, I don't. Anybody who has the book, make sure that you've read and reviewed it on Amazon or wherever you got it to. You can presumably get it from local bookstores and things. They would have to be ordering it through, but that's been done theoretically as well for people who want to go that route. And as a wacky thing, if you want to go through the rigmarole of having a signed copy from the author, you can work with me in an arrangement where, in principle, you get the book and send it to me, and I sign it and send it back, or arrange a thing where you prepay and I get the book and then ship it to you with the thing. That's for the Rolls Royce edition, where you got the signed author. And Jackson, I'm sure, will be willing to do the same kind of thing. So, like a good neighbor, stay over there and wear a mask, please, which I do. Yes, when we go out in the store, there once in a while you see an oddball that isn't doing things. But in my neck of the woods here in conservative Spokane, most everybody is behaving carefully and reasonably on this, and that's one of the reasons why our area is not getting as panic-stricken as other people are, and we're still able to go into businesses and do stuff and all that, which I will be able to drive to again once I get the garage door fixed so I can get the car out of the garage. So thank you, everybody. See you all next week. Stay safe and don't accept any wooden penguins. We are closing off.